Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Saltworks podcast. I'm your host, Hallie Dye. Your favorite co-host, Lindsay, is here with us today, and one of your very favorite guests as well, Emily Jones, is back on the podcast today. You might know parts of Emily's story, and she is coming to share specifically about her parents, her story, and especially her story with grief. It is a wonderful episode, whether you are currently grieving something or walking alongside someone who's grieving something. Emily just does such a wonderful job of coming alongside and giving you permission to feel the way you feel, and also speaking such wonderful truth. She just brings a light into every conversation, and this one is no different. I cannot wait to share it with you. And so here's our conversation with Emily. Well, Emily, this is your fifth time, you were saying.
It's my fifth appearance.
Yes, the
Love
best. I think that's the most we've had.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, if you keep inviting yourself back.
Just stop. That is ridiculous. We have chased you down every time. Okay, you were talking about before we kind of got started that back in season 1 was the first time you were on, and we shared, quote unquote, your story. And you were like, but not really. We really didn't. I didn't feel like that, but I think you felt like you omitted parts or...
Hallie, I was strategic. Look, one of my favorite things about the podcast, I love hearing people's stories. When you first asked me to come on, you were very sensitive to like, hey, there are some parts of my story that haven't been easy. And those are like the most recent. And so I laughed and I was like, you kind of tiptoed around. You said, no, I didn't. I said, yeah, you did. And then I made a decision with the Lord, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And it was to talk about a concept tied to my life. And so like, I'm really good at that. Of taking information and like making it into what I feel led to share. Mm-hmm. It's not manufactured, but I also that time was strategic. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, Lindsay was like, you've never shared your testimony? And I was like, absolutely not. I haven't, so.
Well, today we will be going into parts of it, that, I mean, it is not as fresh, but it's still something that is a very big part of your story, and just something I feel like you can speak to in a lot of different areas, and that is grief and the different facets of it. And I think I almost want to say the permission, like you have permission to grieve. I don't know if that's, what the episode should be called, but like I almost think that when I look through your notes, and I think when people hear different parts, like that will be evident. But I would love for you to share just like the backstory of your experience with grief, and obviously everyone's can look different, but your specifics that it's different.
Yeah. I think to start off with, when I was thinking about and praying about this, for me, the context of grief and what I think of it as is very oriented to like life and death. And so let me say, like, grief is not just about life and death, going back, Hallie, to Lindsay, to your testimony, like grief was tied all through that, and no one died, and so grief is, I think, a friend of ours throughout our lives, even whenever it's not tied to, loss of life. So let me say that. But my story with grief really is tied to death, which I think most people think of it as. And so, yeah, I grew up in a home that was like pretty normal. We didn't have any crises or anything like that. I lost grandparents at appropriate times after you hate to say that, but like they were older. Mm-hmm. We also had indicators that it was coming. There was illness, there was sickness. And I think that's a lot of our stories of like, it still hurts. And some of it's expected. You know, you get
or that person got relief and you know.
Right. And it's you get to use the terminology of like, oh, they lived such a good life. Oh my gosh, thank you. You know, thank you, Lord, that they got 94 years. That's such a blessing. And so that's always been one of my biggest like prayers and pieces of anxiety was around specifically my parents' health and life. I struggle with anxiety. And so a lot of that, I can remember seasons of my life where I would think the worst thing that could happen to me would be like the death of a parent. And I remember I was actually at camp at Sky Ranch when I was 19 years old, calling my dad in a panic, like, are you okay? That's how much that like I feared it and was concerned about it. I guess I need to tell you about my parents.
I think that would be good, as much as you feel led and comfortable.
Oh, yeah. My parents were and are like some of my favorite people in the world. So I was raised in a 2-parent household, but I like to tell people it wasn't a super typical household. So I have 2 older sisters. I am the baby, about 11 and 12 years. Some say accident. I prefer miracle.
Grand finale.
God's great.
Grand finale. I like that.
Yeah, it was grand. So I came along later in life for my parents. My mom was 38 when she had me. So my dad was also 38. They were not anticipating me. And then there came Emily. The same year that I was born, my dad was a Marine and he was a Vietnam veteran. And so the year that I was born, a lot of symptoms of mental health issues started to come up more for him than they had previously in the past. My dad was a drinker back in the day, which is really funny because I never knew him as that. My dad was not a believer until after he married my mother. She was actually part of the reason that he came to the Lord. He was agnostic prior to that. But, you know, he was a Marine in the 60s and in the early 70s. He was not a hippie. He was a Marine. And a big part of that
would not stand for
he would
that
not.
being
So I'll just let the record show. But he was very much a part of like the military culture at that point. And then on top of that, he did 2 tours of Vietnam. Like there was a lot going on there. I personally believe that he drank so much as a form of self-medication for what he was experiencing. If you know anything about the Vietnam War, terrible conflict already. You're already seeing horrific things that you shouldn't see. But then he came home and the military personnel, the veterans, were not well received in society. So my dad probably was harassed more and threatened more coming home in that process than anybody could imagine. And so even when he came home, he wasn't safe. So he wasn't safe for however many months in Vietnam. He wasn't safe when he came home. And so I think to sort of power through that and be the brave man that he was, he found ways to medicate, and that was through alcohol. He would always say, Emily, I was never an alcoholic. I was only a drunk. And so that would be important that he let me, he would want y'all to know that. He would test it every now and then he'd be like, okay, we're good. Like, get back to it.
Just in case you're ever on a podcast.
He was a scientist.
Yeah.
So anyway, all that to say, the year I was born, he stopped drinking. He took his last drink on July 4th, 1988. I was born in January. Pretty soon after that, they thought I had spinal meningitis. I don't even know what that is, but it's not good.
It's not.
So I was in the hospital a lot. My mom was the primary breadwinner. My dad worked 3 or 4 jobs at a time. And so my dad offered to stay home with me after I came back from that. I did not have spinal meningitis.
Yeah.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
And so he offered to stay home with me. And what my mom noticed more and more was that he was no longer going out to parties. When they were at parties, because he was super social, he would like leave rooms and people would follow him because he was the life of the party, and he would just panic. So he stopped doing that. He used me as an excuse more and more to stay home. And my mom sort of figured out like, hey, something's not right. So long story short, come to find out, my dad had like a slew of mental health diagnoses. The biggest one that we talked about the most was called agoraphobia, which like most people don't know what that is, but agoraphobia in Latin means fear of the marketplace. And so it's fear of public places. And so my dad did not do well out of the house or around people that he did not know or was not accustomed to, which is just really a sadness. My dad was such a people person. So it's the exact opposite of like what he was bent towards and who he was that was affected. So he had agoraphobia, high PTSD, all the good stuff. And so my dad became a shut-in. And so I was raised in a household where my mom was the primary breadwinner. She left and went to work every day. And my dad stayed home. He was a disabled veteran. And so he was my parent, like my person. And we just had a really, really sweet relationship my whole life, just because we spent so much time together. And he picked me up from school every day. He dropped me off every day. He knew where I was at all times. You know, he was my person. And we were very similar. We had a lot of the same humor and just handled things in similar ways, which I don't know what that says about me, but it's fine.
And now I'm a therapist. Legacy comes out. I just love it.
And now I help people. Yeah. So anyway, that's a little bit about my dad. So you can understand, like, I had a lot of fear specifically around my parents' health and like, are they going to be there? Because my parents were always there. My mom and I were very close as well. Still are close. She's still here. But man, it was just something that I was fearful of a lot, of what am I going to do with that? So my mom is awesome. I know I didn't speak about her as much. Like I said, she was the breadwinner. She was like just a baller, very successful at work. She was our spiritual leader in the home. My dad was a baby Christian. He was never discipled or in community due to his mental health issues. He was always incredibly supportive of us being in church. Like,
I love that, like, he would cook the stuff that y'all took to fellowships.
He cooked for the potlucks.
Yeah.
Like, I remember, like, we did an auction at our church and everybody was auctioning on my dad's beef tips because they'd all had them. My dad would cook for people. My dad would still talk on the phone to people at our church. He was like a wisdom sounding board for a lot of people, which was really sweet. So even though he wasn't there, he was not the type of man that was like, hey, I'll stay home because I'm home. When those doors to church were open, my mom was taking me and my 3 sisters and we were there. Even when the doors to that church weren't open, we were typically there. My mom was in the Word every morning. She was a Sunday school teacher. And so it was an interesting dynamic because, again, she was really the spiritual leader. She was the one that went out and was working. And then my dad was at home. A lot of times caring for me and my sisters and our emotional needs, being like our sounding board. And so, but my mom, she's the best. She's, you know, she doesn't work. She's retired now, disabled as well. And I'll share a little bit about that later, but we had a sweet relationship too, especially later on in life when she sort of slowed down from the work that she was doing. So,
yeah. Thanks for sharing that background. Okay, I want to get into, like, when you're grown and just to tell, like, some perspective, like, about Sam and your dad, if you feel comfortable, and just, like, what that dynamic looked like. Because I do think that adds a layer to your grief in a lot of ways, about, like, your dad's in contact with all those people from church, you know, but as a grown-up, most of your friends never met him.
Well, never met him, but talked to him.
Yeah.
So, I can share about that. So, nobody was allowed to come to my house. And so people could pick me up and I could go. But really, it was like, that was sort of his safety zone in his car. And so, I never had boyfriends that met him. And that included Sam Jones. My husband never met my dad face to face, which everybody's always like, what? Like, that is so weird. And like, I can pull back and be like, it is weird. I think one of my favorite things about Sam was that he never pushed that or questioned it, not because he didn't care or he wasn't curious, but just because he always just accepted my dad as he was. And like, not everybody has always been comfortable with that. And so that really set Sam apart for me. But they also had a relationship. So my dad was a huge phone talker. Just because he didn't see people, he was still like incredibly social. So I would have friends growing up that would call the house and talk to my dad, and I'd be waiting for the home phone to be passed to me so I could have a part of the conversation too. And that would happen with my dad and Sam. They had a lot of similarities just around their interest in history and the military and politics and all of those things. And so, yeah, my dad, being one of the most important people in my life, this is always pretty shocking for people. Like, he didn't walk me down the aisle at my wedding.
Mm-hmm.
He asked if he could, and he had walked my sister Chrissy down the aisle. But I asked him not to walk me down the aisle. And it's not because I didn't desperately want him there. It's because, like, I knew that putting him in that position, in that situation, was going to be really hard for him. And I know he would have done it anyway, but he respected that wish of mine. And so, you know, it's always one of those things that people are like, you were close with your dad, but he didn't walk you down the aisle. And it was like, yeah. And I look back and I'm like, I really had a protective role with my dad, which I don't know was always the best thing, but it's what I knew to do was to protect him and keep him
He didn't
safe.
ask you to do that.
He
but
never
you-
asked
yeah.
me to, but I still, like, that was my job. You know, that was my dad. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about my dad and Sam's relationship. And it was different, but it was still something that I don't know. I always look back on that and I think about Sam especially, and I'm so grateful for like his acceptance of something that is odd from the outside looking in, but like he just walked into it.
Yeah.
And that played a huge part later on when we were walking through all of the health issues of Sam's like unconditional support in the midst of that. So
getting into your dad's health, because I know like there's a series of events that in my mind felt like this happened and this happened and this happened. Can you kind of walk us through that season and what that looked like?
Yeah.
With both of your parents, but starting with your dad.
Sure. So my dad's health decline was gradual, I would say. And I look back on that, and that is one of like the Lord's biggest kindnesses to me. And I know he didn't have to do what he did, and it was still really terrible and really hard. Probably my dad would not say that was a kindness to him, you know, that walk that he had, but for me it was. So in 2018, I was like newly pregnant with Hadley, and my dad had his first stroke. So my dad was not the healthiest fella. He was overweight and he was a chain smoker, you guys, like a chain smoker. It's not a good idea. If you're out there listening and you're holding a cigarette, let Dennis be your example. It's not the best idea. Sorry. You might want to edit that out.
I know you were going to regret that, but you shouldn't. Keep going.
So anyway, vaping too, but that's the next podcast.
Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, he obviously did a ton of damage to his body throughout his years. You know, he was a heavy drinker. I don't know that super had an impact on him. But he did keep up with his health really well. He loved his doctor that he had. So he went for regular doctor's visits and he lifted weights. And so he exercised in the home. He made dietary changes where needed. So he was cognizant of that and did the best that he could do. And we all know, like, there's only so much we can actually do and that we're in control of. And so my dad did have a stroke in 2018, and that was a super traumatic experience for me and my mom and my sisters for a myriad of reasons. But he was able to rehab from that. He was in a rehab facility. He learned to walk again, and he was able to go home. And so that was something that was, you know, a long road. I think he was in the hospital for maybe 2 months. But my mom really took the lead on all of that, and we were more supportive players during that time. And so I was so grateful that, you know, he was okay and everything was going to be fine. And so had Hadley. My dad's personality began to change over the next few years. I noticed my dad and I talked on the phone every single day. And so his mannerisms, how he talked to us, all of us, just, it sort of started to decline. And you could tell he wasn't the same person that he had been previously. And that was really hard. I think that's actually where my grief began. And I didn't even realize it, that the Lord was preparing me for what was to come.
Yeah.
And again, it was a painful kindness because our relationship did change in that, because there was only so much I could do.
Yeah.
as a mom of 2 kids, married with my own family and trying to invest and make sure that my parents were okay. But he changed. He was never unkind or mean, but it was just different. And so in 2021 is whenever his health stuff really ramped up, and he ended up having multiple strokes, little TIAs that we had no clue about. And we had to keep calling the ambulance. He had to keep going. It was taking a huge toll on my mom. And so finally, at the end of the day, at the end of like the culmination, we finally started to get some answers. And my dad he had been having like multiple strokes, and we had no idea. And I think he was diagnosed with, they called it cardiovascular dementia. And so my dad had been slowly changing over time. We just didn't know about it, right? And he didn't know about it or what was going on. And so that last time he went into the hospital was probably in August. And that was like the last time he ever came out. And so very stressful period for my family, hard and sad, because I think we started somewhat coming to terms with like, hey, it's not going to get better. He's not going to come back. And my dad at that point was only 71. So my parents were not old, in my opinion, by any stretch of the imagination. All of my grandparents lived into their 90s. And so that was hard to deal with, especially for my mom. You know, my mom and my dad, their marriage was really, really cool. To a lot of people, it probably seemed unconventional. My mom is a huge example for me of like how to love someone well, even when circumstances aren't ideal, you know? And I don't know about y'all, but can you imagine like your husband not being able to go places with you? And a lot of times at church, people would either assume that her husband was dead or that she was divorced, you know, and then she got to do the big reveal of he's neither, you know? So anyway, I don't know. It was hard on all of us, and it sort of turned to where we started to put the focus on my mom of like, how are we going to care for her in the midst of this?
I also like, not to pause you, but I also think like there was probably some grieving, Emily, like as someone who wants to be a protector, that like your daddy couldn't be home.
Absolutely.
And like he did not like that, and you knew you couldn't fix that for him.
Yeah, we were consistently up and down at Glenwood. Like, what does he need? How can we get it to him? How do we, you know, like how can we bring this to him? And so, yeah, it was really hard. And there was also, I think at that point I'd done some work on myself and realized what was in my control and out of my control. And so my mom, like I said, she really carried the brunt of that. And you have to remember, 2021 was still COVID.
Yeah.
And so like there was only so much we could do to get into that hospital. I think we called in favors with random people to have more than one person in there at a time, because Phillipses are pack animals. Like, if one's there, we're all going to be there. It's exhausting, but it's true, you know, and I'm thankful for that. But we had to figure out, how are we all going to get in there? How are we going to do that together? And so that was in September. In early September, like we started end of life preparations, even financially for my mom of, okay, what's this going to look like? How are we going to make sure that she's set and taken care of? Because we didn't know what the outcome would be. Is he going to be in a nursing home? Is he, you know, that's actually what we thought was going to happen. And so like, how do we make sure she's okay? Cause she had retired from her full-time job. She was working a part-time church job as like her retirement gig at that point. And so that's the road we were on of like, okay, how do we help my mom? And honestly, like there's going to be a piece of this of like, my mom's going to have more freedom than she's ever had before, because even in all of the good years, she was still my dad's caretaker. You know, she was his person. And so there was some kind of like, okay, like life is going to look different, and, you know, he's going to be okay. We had no doubt that my dad was a believer, and we also knew his personality and what he wanted for my mom. And so like we were able to move in peace towards making future decisions for him, because we knew him so well and what that would look like. So that's sort of where we were. And then, everything felt smooth at the very least. It was still very painful, but we were in control, and that's where we like to be. Right. And so then one morning I got a call while I was at work from my sister that my mom had been found on the ground of her home. And so of course trauma kicks in, because that's not good. I panic and I just haul tail there. My mom had a stomach bug the previous 2 days, or so we had thought. So she hadn't been able to go to the hospital with my dad, and she'd been to the doctor. She was just sick. She was sick as a dog, but it was, like I said, stomach bug symptoms. And it was not the stomach bug, but it was also something that a doctor could have caught. So
Yeah.
control, the smooth sailing that we had, was like automatically ripped from us. And so we found out that my mom, I think that was around 9 o'clock that morning, my mom had a stroke probably around 8 o'clock that night. And because my dad wasn't home, she was by herself. So she had no way to call. It was a debilitating stroke. She couldn't move, couldn't do any of those things. And so, man, like, I think back on the goodness of God, that could have gone really sideways because my mom, she didn't sit by the phone like my dad did. We always knew my dad would answer the phone, but mom was a goer and a blower, you know? And so I'd actually called her that night and she didn't answer. And I think my other sister had called her as well. Well, we didn't think anything of it because that's okay. And it's funny, that night around 1 a.m., I woke up and I could not go back to sleep. I was like, I wasn't distraught, but something in me was like, I was just awake. And my older sister, Chrissy, and I were talking. She woke up around the same time I did and was just like unsettled and not at peace. And I was able to get back to sleep that night, but not knowing that my mom was by herself.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Yeah.
Not sort of. She was by herself and had just been through a major medical trauma. And so, the control that we had was like ripped from us. And the grief that was already there, but felt somewhat more predictable and controlled, was all of a sudden like there was a tidal wave of there's no control of this situation anymore. And so it was very hard and very jarring.
Yeah. Well, and I know like that took y'all into a season of how can we be over here with him and over here with her. You didn't want him to know, like all of that and still trying to hold all the pieces. But now you and your sisters are the caretakers.
Yeah. Well, actually at that point, my dad was pretty much the dementia, like it went rapidly.
Yeah.
And so, my dad actually never knew that my mom was not well, which is such a mercy, like from God. And I can look back and I can see all of those things as grace and mercy, even though it didn't feel that way at the time, but he never knew. And I'm so I'm grateful for that he wasn't aware.
How long was your mom in the hospital? Was it about 3 months?
3 months, Allie. And my mom, so like her stroke was not like my dad's first one, which was where he was still himself. He was still talking. He could communicate. My mom had to learn to talk again. She was paralyzed totally on one side of her body. Had to learn to swallow, like she couldn't eat. It was a very traumatic 3 months in that hospital. And again, it was COVID.
Yeah.
And so my sisters and I, like I said, I have 2 sisters. We just sort of made the decision that we had to be there at all times. Like one of us had to be there and only one of us could be there, which was also really hard because my mom could not communicate. And I know that doctors and nurses do the best that they can. And like advocacy is so important when you're involved in a medical crisis.
Yeah.
And so, me and my sisters took 24-hour shifts in the hospital for 3 months. And it was horrible, y'all. It was so difficult. And I always like to laugh. My sisters and I, if Emily was at the hospital, something bad was going to happen that night. Like it was without fail. My sisters would be like, she had a great day. Everything went perfect. And then I'd be there and she was like, she never coded. That was wrong. But it's like something traumatic happened when Emily was there and I'd come out like shaking and crying and they were like, okay, well, see you back in a few days, and because we couldn't, there would be so many nights my sisters would just be up texting or we would text with each other because we couldn't be there with one another. And then you were there with my mom who at times she was on feeding tubes. What happened was she had an infection in her heart that grew vegetation, which I didn't know that could happen.
Yeah.
And the vegetation broke off at one point because it got so large and that went into her brain and caused the stroke. And so again, nothing anybody could have known. There was no way for us to find that out. But with that came the possibility of, oh my gosh, well, she's got to have heart surgery. She's got to be on a feeding tube. Like there were just so many things that happened. And again, if it was going to happen, it was going to be when Emily was there. So 3 months and, the already so painful and difficult to see your perfectly well and vibrant mother go to the opposite while knowing
Yeah.
And of course, our dad was in a different hospital. And so we were separated that way too.
Mhm.
But also on top of that, like I got pulled from my role of like everyday life of being mom, of being wife,
Mhm.
because when I was at that hospital, I couldn't leave. You could not leave without somebody else coming in
Yeah.
because it was just too risky. So I would go stretches where I wouldn't get to see my husband and my kids for too long for
Yeah.
me, you know.
Yeah.
So it was a hard season for
Mhm.
everybody that was involved.
Yeah. I want you to talk about something before we go into your dad's passing and that wave of grief. And it's kind of leading up to that, I guess. It's like you hit on, I forget exactly how you said it earlier, but like essentially kind of acknowledging that like it's hard to grieve whenever someone has not passed. And I do think like I'd love for you to talk about that for just a second, like with your dad and with your mom, of like, it's like they've not passed, but I mean, on one hand, you're grieving that like your mom is retired. She was about to have freedom of her day, and she doesn't have kids in the home anymore, and your dad's well taken care of, and it did feel smooth sailing. And so like grieving that, but then also grieving like in that season where you're calling your dad and you didn't know of the dementia yet, and you're like, I guess the piece I keep coming back to is like that sometimes maybe that feels disloyal to grieve the person that you've always known when that person's still here. And how did you learn to walk that out? Like, what encouragement would you have for people?
Well, I think number one, I think for me, grief at times felt selfish, especially when there were still people there to take care of, you know. And even you're right, it felt hard to grieve and be sad. So I think about my mom specifically. It was hard to grieve and be sad, and on the other hand, be so grateful that she was with us. It felt very conflicted a lot of times. For me internally, even though I can look at it subjectively and be like, no, like it's a hard and a good thing at the same time. But when your brain is trying to process like, hey, our whole life has been turned around, everything's been taken from us, or so it felt, even though that wasn't true, it was a lot to reconcile.
Yeah.
And so I think honestly, I struggled with it a lot at first because instead of allowing myself to feel grief, I allowed myself to be swept up into the busyness of what needed to be done and the decision making, and the trying to get control any way I could. I do not think it's an accident that every time that I was in the hospital with my mom, that the Lord took control from me. You know, like, we're going to have a nice, smooth night. No, you're not. Not tonight. So what are you going to do with that? And so, yeah, I think grief is difficult because number one, it can feel really selfish. Number two, it can make people around you feel really uncomfortable. And number three, it can be really confusing, especially when there's still joy to be had and gratitude to be found and like goodness to be seen. It's a lot to reconcile. So I don't know if that's advice as much as it is just validation of like a lived experience of it's a lot. It's a lot to grieve.
Well, and I think too, like, kind of like you said at the beginning, you know, some of the grief that because I mean, I have experienced grief of like loss of loved ones, but like some of the grief that I've experienced and the others, like different things we walk through where like life just doesn't look like we thought it would. And like, there's a grief to that. And I would say like with your parents, like that's kind of at this point where it's at, you know, obviously there's not a loss of life at that point, but there's a gajillion things out of control. Like we have a hard time with that because I feel like sometimes, like when I think about like grandparents or things, like you said at the beginning, like there's a grief to someone who's like, you lose someone, you know, at the end of their life, they've lived a good life. You have that whole mentality. And I think we can put it in a box and think, oh, well, grief is always like this neat little thing that we can wrap up and say like, well, but they're with the Lord. And like, we can add all those
truths that also can be platitudes.
I was about to say spiritual platitudes, you know, some of that are true, but also like, I don't know, like we don't necessarily like allow ourselves to recognize that like well, both things can be true. Like it can be hard, and I can be sad, and I can grieve this, and they can be in a better place, and they can be healed. So like when we're walking through things that grieve us, and it doesn't fit in that nice, neat, you can't slap a spiritual platitude on it, and make it feel better. Like we don't. It's hard. Like that's hard to.
It's so hard.
Reconcile those two things.
That was something that I'm so grateful. I look back and I don't remember, unless I just blacked it out, anybody giving me any of those spiritual platitudes. I remember a lot of people just looking at me, and that would have bothered me previously. I don't like people to see those things in me, but I had nothing, it was all gone. And it was almost the relief of there being no place for platitudes in them, even though they're true, what I mean? Like,
right.
So that was, you said something a minute ago though, Lindsay, that was, the loss of everything you thought it would be. And like, that's my daily grief, you know what I mean? And so it's interesting to think about grief as a journey. There are those steps that people talk about, like denial, anger, stuff like that. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. That's not my jam, I don't think. But I do think that the grief that I experienced in 2021 and 2022 is a different grief than what I experience now, which is a daily. I think if you have ever been on a grief journey and you've like been honest and open about it, like grief is not a done. I've had people say like, have you dealt with your grief? And I'm like, what an interesting concept.
Yeah.
Because that
over and done, did that.
It implies past tense, and like, no, if that's the case, then like, no, I haven't dealt with my grief.
I think a good question, if you're seeing signs that someone isn't maybe denial, like, have you acknowledged? Maybe could be a good question, but like dealt with is not.
Yeah, it's past tense, and so it's funny because like I consider grief like at this point companion, and like I don't feel dark when I say that. I don't feel hopeless when I say that, but I think that I have a truer and more mature sense of loss and its impact that's brought me closer to the Father. And so like I'm okay with that daily grief. And trust me, there are some days I don't take it out. I don't want to touch it, but it's there.
Yeah.
Well, and in all this, like you mentioned spiritual platitudes and like how those things don't just make the feeling better and you feeling like, like I do feel more mature and still like it's not something that's over and dealt with. Like I think we serve a God that very much reflected that. Like,
absolutely.
I mean, Jesus knew he would raise Lazarus, but he wept, like not teared up, which would be a lot, but wept, and when he heard news of John the Baptist, like in his death and his execution, like he pulled away to be with the Father, even though he knew he was on the path to redeem him and all of mankind. Like, like that's who we follow. And so to expect ourselves to not feel, and it doesn't have to fit a box, but to not feel at all is not rightful thinking. And it's certainly not rightful thinking to put on someone else.
Absolutely.
Emily, I don't want to cut you off of things that the Lord was teaching you in that time, but I also like want to ask, moving into the next season where your dad is gone and you're still walking these things with your mom, like what did that look like for you and how did that come about?
Okay, so good question. What did that look like for you? Now, edit that out. I don't know. It's kind of a before and after thing is still there. I think each season has looked differently, So my mom, we prayed and prayed and prayed for miraculous healing. Really like had a belief that like God could give her back and restore whatever had been taken. And I still believe that. And I've still seen that. but really had to come to terms with and peace with that he had already done the miraculous just by keeping her with us. You know, again, it was that loss of, well, what I wanted to happen didn't happen.
Yeah.
So that's been an evolution, and my mom is still with us. We kept her home for a year she has to have 24-hour care. She's now at a local facility that is amazing and has been such a gift to us. But yeah, grief now looks a little bit more like, what was your question?
Well, I do want you to talk about like grief now with your mom, and also like the grieving of your dad passing, you know, like, because those things were happening alongside each other.
So my dad passed away in December. It happened. It's funny. It felt sudden.
Yeah.
I had actually started to pray that the Lord would take him, just because we had to make decisions along the way that I don't know that he would have been happy with. But we were in such crisis, I didn't know what else to do. And this is a interesting aside as well. Like, all of our focus shifted to our mom after my mom had her stroke. And a lot of people, especially with how close my dad and I were, would ask how we were able to do that. And honestly, doing 24-hour shifts, we could not do both. Like, it just was not possible. And so my sisters and I really had to ask ourselves the question, like, what would our dad want? What would he want? And we had no doubt that he would have said, if you don't get your tail over to that hospital where your mother is, I'm fine. Like, that would have been what he had said. I'm fine. I'm fine. And at that point, he was far past. He didn't know me when I came in the room. I went and saw him multiple times while he was in the facilities after, and that was so difficult. And he wasn't there in a sense anymore. So again, we had to make decisions that prolonged his life, that again, I was concerned about, but we did the best we could do in that situation. My sisters and I did, and we feel very confident in that. And so one morning in December, I got the call from my oldest sister that my dad had passed away. And it's so funny that grief and gratitude commingle or can commingle in such an interesting way. It was very painful because that was kind of like the culmination of my lifelong fear that my dad will not be there anymore, right? That he'll be gone. It happened. Like, everything that I was scared of that I knew was going to happen one day, it happened. But then also the Lord met us in that and like took him out of suffering. You know, it'd be really easy for us to say like, God, why didn't you? Why couldn't you? Why wouldn't you have? And I don't feel like that's where we ever went. It was more of a, hey, thank you. Thank you for like the ending of this part of his story and the beginning of healing and health and no more mental disorder issues and no more health issues. Like, gosh, what a gift. And I'll tell you, Hallie, like, that is the first time, and I think this is a good work that God has done in me, that I longed for heaven. Like, those months in the hospital with my mom, my dad passing, I used to be very scared of death. I don't know what that was about. Probably pretty normal. That's not a fear of mine anymore. In any way, shape, or form. I'm not rushing towards it. And I work really hard to make sure I don't end up in the same, you know, I do my best to work out and take care of myself. And like, I don't know, I so look forward to that now. And so it's interesting that like grief turns into expectation and sits with joy and gratitude and also like deep sadness all at once. Like, it's a very interesting lived experience. And I'm hopeful, you know, for the people that are listening that are believers, that they get to experience all of those different emotions within their grief, because like there's room for multiple things to be happening at the same time. There's room to be sad. There's room to be angry. I was super annoyed with the Lord multiple times. Like, did we have to do this? Was this really like the best way? And I can look back and I can say it didn't feel good, but I trust that it was the best way, you know? So
one of the things you've talked about, is you've said always speak to someone's grief. Like, and I think there have been so many people who have spoken to like, don't say dumb things. And I agree. Like, we do need to be mindful, and like, we will all put our foot in our mouth about many things, kids, death, marriage, like things you don't know until you know, like, so how do we do that, while also being mindful of how to do that well?
So I think with before my parents' stuff, I was always super careful around grief. Like I had these rules in my head that were like, I can't say anything to them because I'm not that close, or well, I didn't know the person that passed away. So like, how am I supposed to speak to that?
Mm-hmm.
And it felt more sensitive and more kind to just not say anything or to move on forward as though things were normal, because that sort of seems like what grieving people want, is like I can't talk. Let's just do what the normal thing is. And so it felt like a kindness to do that. But going through that prolonged trauma and grief, I found, especially when I couldn't get out of it, because we were doing 24-hour cycles in the hospital. There was no distraction. There was no respite, right? And there was no finality to some of it. My mom came out, praise God, alive. So like. Again, that prolonged grief. But when there was some kindness in people not treating me as all that was, there was also the most kindness was being able to sit with someone and have them not look away when it wasn't my best. There was kindness when people would ask about my parents and ask about my dad, even when they didn't know him, right? And just to see how I was doing with that. And then to move on from it, I've had friends who have come and sat with me and just watched me cry. I had friends who muscled their way into the hospital when we weren't supposed to have any more visitors and sat in a really hard room with my mom who was not well, and that's very uncomfortable for people. And so that's what it looks like. I'll tell you one of the kindest ways, and like this comes up for me every year because I have a picture of it on my time hop. In our life group, without me asking, because you don't even know how to ask for what it is that you need when you're grieving or when you're in chaos or crisis. I got a picture one night, and it was a 24-hour prayer schedule that everybody in our life group had signed up to do, and it was filled. And that was like the most beautiful thing that I've ever had sent to me, because there were people on that chain that like I know well, and they know me well, and I know they would have done that regardless. And then there were people that were in our life group that I just wasn't as close to, or maybe they were brand new and they still signed up to do that. And so like that was just a very physical representation of not only am I going to not turn away from your pain, but I'm going to advocate for you in your pain, even if I can't be with you in your pain. And so I don't know. I think it can look like a lot of things. One of the nicest things that ever happens to me, it has even happened today in this room, and that's just when people laugh with you about the person that like you love. You know what I mean? Of like, I'm not going to be uncomfortable and not talk about your dad. And so we're going to, even though y'all never met my dad, but you know him because you know me. And so like just getting to share in that and not in the hardship of the end, man, like that's such a gift. Such a gift.
When I think about your specific journey with grief, like I think about what a gift that has been for you, because it's not like you're going to bump into a coworker of his. It's like, I was just thinking about your dad the other day. Like it is different because like, yes, people did know him, but it does look different because of his life, And so like, I do think about how much of a gift that is for you to have people remember,
Yes. And there's a big piece of me too. So like for me, I sometimes don't let people turn away from my grief in the way of not of like, look at me, I'm so sad, but more of I am a storyteller by like nature. I get that from my dad. And so like I tell stories about my parents consistently. And I'm one of the blessed one that like a lot of my stories about my parents are fabulous. Like my dad was hilarious. He was funny. He was a great dad, And so I don't know, even just to get to share with people about who he was outside of that, like that for me is like, I want you to know, because that's part of me continuing the joy part and not just the grief.
I love that. So I want to flip back to your mom. your mom made leaps and strides in a lot of areas.
Mhm.
And also, like, there were some, like, small moments of grief along the way where it's like, we do have to keep moving, but also, like, we thought we would be able to do this, or we thought it would look like this. And so you're continuing to walk. And so I would love for you to talk about that, but then also talk about, on the flip side, some of the things that you had settled, this is never going to happen.
Yeah. So, I think some of it's normal. I was a late in life baby. I've already made, like, I knew that. So my mom got to do a lot of things with my nephews that she doesn't necessarily get to do with my kids. She's still incredibly engaged in our lives. She's better at it than we are because we're so busy. So she did. She made leaps and bounds. She has done things that we were told, we were told she would have to have open heart surgery. We were told she would, maybe have to have a feeding tube. There were just so many things that was like worst case scenario. And my mom really, is it the perfect scenario that she's come out in? Absolutely not. I could name a million other things I wish had happened. And we can see God's grace through all of that. But part of, like, my grieving has been trying to make peace with what is and not what I wish could be. And so, like, how do I, and I fail at this consistently, how do I love my mother well with where she's at and, like, accept her, like this new version of my mom. She's still very much herself with just some physical limitations, but she's still my mom and just fabulous. So that's been sort of my walk of, like, can I be at peace with this when I want it to be this way? Can I? And 50% of the time I'd say, yeah, I can be. But I also, one of my biggest things throughout my time in the hospital with my mom and throughout her illness and even my dad's illness was I would just run in my mind, like, is God good? Like, if he allows this, is he who he says he is? Like, and never in a, like, you're not who you say you are, but just, like, truly curious of, like, I know it and I'm trying to reconcile it with what I'm seeing. The good news is I came out on the other side believing very much that God is good. And one of my favorite things to tell people is after my mom had been out of the hospital for about 6 months and was at home, my dad had passed away and that was really hard. I remember sitting down and looking at her one day and I was like, hey, do you think God is good? And I do that sometimes. I just come up with random questions. And she looked at me and she goes, what kind of question is that? And I was like, I need to know, like, do you think God is still good after all this? And she looked at me just like I was, and she goes, of course he is good. And for somebody that's sitting across from you that has lost so much, to be able to look at you when she, you look at it and selfishly, like, a lot was taken from me and my sisters during that time, for sure. And then you look at it and you're like, but I wasn't the one in the bed. She was. And for that to be her response after all of that, after the loss of her husband, after the loss of, like, independence and ability to make decisions, like, her response that was, of course. And she didn't say it, but her eyes did, you idiot, And so for me, that was that moment almost where it was like the Lord being like, hey, of course I'm good. Like, and that, like, if you need me to remind you, I will.
Yeah.
And so that's been a really sweet part of, like, I see God's goodness pretty frequently. I think what you're talking about, Hallie, is a few months ago, my sisters and I got this text message from one of the physical therapists at my mom's facility. And there was nothing other than this video. And it was my mom walking, like, with zero help whatsoever. We had no clue that she was working on that. We had no clue that that was ever a possibility. It, like, was breathtaking to behold and to see because, like, I had made my peace with that was never going to happen. And I didn't need for it to happen. And that's really where I was. And I look back on that video and that day and I was like, of course he's good. Like, he didn't have to give us that. He didn't have to give her that. Nothing will come of it. Like, she's not walking around today, but she can. And, like, God showed his goodness, even in the things that he didn't have to, even in the things that, like, we had said, like, that won't happen. And even in the, like I said, in the long scheme of things, she's not a walker anymore, but she can. And he did that just because Yeah. Like, just because that's the kind of God he is. And so that's where I always go back to of like, oh no, he's good. He's good.
I listen to like you talk about your dad's story and like his strengths and your mom's story and her strengths. And like, I'm not going to cry while I'm saying this.
I hope you do, so I won't be the only one.
No, I already cried. I just got to do that silently while you're talking. But like your dad being the wisdom like sounding board, because that's the way he could love. Like he couldn't be at the game cheering, but like he could be in the emotional aspect with you. Like that was his strength. Like, and he actually had more capacity to do that than most of us who are running the roads and are getting to see people. And like he did that so intentionally with you. And like I see that in you. Like that's his legacy, you know. And then your mom, like being able to love someone where they are, you know, and like see someone where they are. And like, I just see both of those things so well in you, you know. And the flip side of that is like, you tend to be the protective caretaker of almost everyone that will let you, and sometimes unwillingly. She's like, yeah, I'm not going to deny it. Like, let's call it what it is. And there's so many other things that like I could ask you, Emily, but I know you've got a meeting and there are 1,000 things we could talk about. But I guess the last question I want to ask is like, so many people can feel like I've always had to be the strong one, or, you know, I know this is grief. Do I need to seek counseling? Do I need to let people love me? Like how did you let people care for you? Like as someone who views it like that's my job.
Well, the Lord took that away from me as well, which was a kindness. Like I know whenever somebody says, well, he took that, it can seem like it's not. And it was, I literally had nothing. Like there was no more, I don't consider it a facade because I'm not hiding or being fake, but there was no more capacity to do the things that I'd done previously. And so like I had no choice. I knew that no matter what, that I had to stay faithful, not for appearance's sake, but for me. Blake was on this podcast one time and he said something to the effect of like, I had to keep singing even though I didn't know. And like that, I took that, that was my story of like, I'm going to keep showing up. We were at church every Sunday. I didn't go to the hospital on weekends. My oldest sister was kind and let me be at home with my kids. We did not miss a Sunday at church because I knew that that's where I needed to be. I knew that even though I was constantly in his presence, I needed to be in his house and I needed to let people see me so that I could be cared for. And so honestly, at first there was no choice. Like when you're wrung out and there's nothing else left, like I'm just thankful that I had people around me that were willing to pick up my limp noodle body and like drag me where I needed to go. I can't tell you how many times I like to sit in the back at church. And I think Andrew one Sunday, the back was taken and I was like, because I had I was like, I don't know where else to sit. And somebody made a row like for me to sit in the back. In life group, when we would talk about hard things, people wouldn't shy away from those topics, but they would look at me and like that was caring. I had people show up at my house when I did not invite them to my house and say, hey, I'm just going to sit. And so like, yeah, I don't think it was a letting people care for me. I think that God was gracious enough to take away any barrier to where that would not be a possibility. And I think I learned a lot in that season of how to do that well. I still struggle because my bent is to be more concerned about what's going on with you than it is to be like, I think every now and then I'll be like, this is really hard. And then I'll say my 3 sentences and I'm like, okay. Yeah. So I think I learned in that season that like community is not a luxury. It's a survival tool. I would not have made it. Number one, without like my family community. My husband was, if you want to know how to like walk grief out well, look at Sam Jones because he's just always there and he is a servant. And he was my ride or die. But outside of that, community just came alongside and did their job. And I think that I was just not foolish enough or didn't have the energy enough to stop them. And I'm grateful for that.
Yeah.
And it's changed the way I do community now as well.
Yeah.
So
thank you so much for sharing. I know that those are hard things to share, even like if you're not in the midst, you know, like that's just, it does take a lot of vulnerability and just honesty of like, this is what I had and this is what the Lord did, you know, and it's still ongoing.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Like that's the hard and the beauty of it. It's like, it's hard that you can't just view it as this is how I dealt with it. But the beauty of it is like the Lord's alongside us.
And I would encourage any believer that is struggling with grief in any way to like make room for the reality and the truth that grief can feel all consuming. But like God points to lament in scripture as an act of worship. And so like our grief can either be a weapon of worship or it can be the thing that sinks us.
Yeah.
And so I would encourage people who are struggling with that to see grief as an act of gratitude and an act of worship. And if we put that in the right place, and if we let it be where God intends it to be, which is a place that we can be comforted by Him, we can draw nearer to Him, we can know Him more fully, man, it won't be in vain, you know, and like I knew it wouldn't be in vain. I'm so thankful that I've had relationships that make grief real for me. You know what I mean? There's so many people that, and this is a totally different topic, that have conflicted grief, you know, that had hard relationships with people who have passed or trauma tied up in that. And so I know I speak from a place of privilege when I say that, but I think that there's a lot of room for multiple things to be going on at the same time.
Yeah.
And for the Lord to change our perspective on our grief if we'll allow Him to.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It's always so good when you come.
Should we tell a joke? I don't have one.
We can, but you're 2 minutes late.
We got to go, sadly.
Thank you, Emily, for coming. That was so good. And we appreciate you. And thank y'all so much for listening in this week. I know there was so much to process, and that just feels like a breath of fresh air for you to hear someone else say and give you the permission. And we can't wait to see you next week on The Salt Works.
This is my story. This is your story.